Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you this evening. My name is Kerry Tocock, and I'm the Head of Communications, Marketing and Events here at Wiltshire Council. If you wish to see closed captions of the speaker's words this evening, please click the CC button on the bottom right of the screen. They should appear after 30 seconds or so. Sometimes the system takes a while to warm up. If you have any technical issues, they can usually be solved by closing down the meeting link and rejoining. You're welcome to submit a question to be answered using the chat function. Please also leave your name. We'll try to provide written replies in the chat, and our presenters will also verbally answer as many as they're able to. Some of you have also pre-submitted questions for this evening, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. I'll now hand you over to Terence Herbert, the Chief Executive, who will get us underway.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for taking the time out to join us this evening. Now, as you probably know, we've hosted a number of these sessions over the course of the pandemic, and we've actually found them a very useful way of sharing information with you all. Now, COVID-19 seems to be unwelcomely sticking around and for the foreseeable future. And although we've seen some recent changes in national guidance and case numbers still being high, we thought that it would be a good time to host another session. Kit Blackburn, our Director of Public Health, who you all know, will update you shortly on the latest position across Wiltshire on COVID-19. But it's not just about COVID-19 tonight. But later on, you'll also be hearing more about our 2022-23 budget proposals, which were published last week. Very pleased to say that the Wiltshire Council leader, Councillor Richard Clewer, and Andy Brown, Wiltshire Council's Corporate Director for Resources, the Deputy Chief Executive, and our 151 officer. He's got a very long job title there, but in essence, that means Andy's our Chief Finance Officer. He will also be joining us and answering any questions that you may have. Now, our proposals for the budget will have an impact on your daily lives as we strive to continue to provide you with all of the services you need to the high standard that you expect. But we'll be doing this whilst attempting to reduce our overall budget deficit. Before we get properly started, though, on behalf of absolutely everybody at the Council, we hope you're all doing well. We last hosted one of these in July of last year, and a lot has certainly happened in the last 6 months. Now, we know that we've had a degree of normality back in our lives, but we appreciate that this is still a rather anxious, unsettling and uncertain time. So we hope you've managed to navigate through all of this as best as you possibly can. Now, in terms of working and local government, there's never been a time like this before. The pandemic's fundamentally changed how we work and it's changed the culture of our organisation. It's having a huge impact on how we provide the services that you receive from us every day. And now, of course, we wouldn't have wished for this pandemic, but in many ways it has made us stronger as a council. We feel much more connected to yourselves, our residents, our businesses, our schools, and all of the other public sector organisations that we work with. And during this period, the links that we've had with our key partners have been strengthened. And as you know, relationships have never been as vital as they are during this period. And we've now formed what I hope are long-lasting partnerships that will serve us well in the future. We hope that you haven't noticed too much or any disruption to our services, as some of these aren't quite as straightforward to manage as they were during the pandemic, and we have worked incredibly hard to maintain our services without too much disruption. There were 500 different roles and services that the council provides, from looking after children in care, vulnerable adults. As you know, we empty your bins, we maintain, we improve the roads, we provide you with high quality leisure and library services, as well as processing and determining planning applications. to name but a few. But we've also made during this period really big progress on some key large-scale projects, like managing the largest number of elections this county has ever seen at one time, as well as holding that second unforeseen one that you may have read about or even voted in. We've continued to build affordable housing. We've launched our climate strategy, which we're really quite proud of, and we've developed plans for a bypass in Melksham. We've progressed the Trowbridge and Salisbury Future High Street Fund projects, and as you know, the construction of the Melksham Community Campus is ongoing. We've also had to carry out some additional responsibilities directly linked to the pandemic, which central government has passed to us, and you may or may not know that a number of those are still ongoing. That includes delivering a programme where we've supported over 34,000 business support grants, and that's a total of over 176 million. And we've also set up and operated our own track and trace service and our own lateral flow test collection sites throughout the county. Now, I don't normally shout praise from the rooftops, because at the end of the day, it's our job to serve you, the public, but I'd like to take this opportunity to say that I'm very proud of my staff for their tremendous commitment to helping the county through the pandemic, and in many cases getting stuck into jobs and tasks that they weren't originally employed to do, and certainly weren't in their role descriptions, and they did that with the minimum of fuss. We have changed our structures in the council, and that's enhancing our ability to work, I believe, in a much more agile way, and that will see services continue to improve and will enable us to deliver our new business plan, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that shortly. Now, the way our council works and delivers needs to reflect the way that you live your lives, and that's something that we're all passionate about instilling. And if you get that right, it means you'll ultimately benefit from the improved service. So that's it from me for now. Be pleased to hear, but thanks as ever for all of your support. And I'm going to hand over to Professor Blackburn, who's the Director of Public Health for Wiltshire. Yes.
Thanks, Terence, and I'd like to echo your thanks to everybody as well. The commitment of the people who live and work in Wiltshire in adhering to guidance, supporting each other, keeping everyone around us as safe as possible throughout all of this time, and it has been a long time, has been incredibly impressive, and it's never taken for granted. And we know that many people will have suffered heartache and anxiety and loneliness, to name but a few emotions, and that nothing about this situation has been easy. And even as we try and live our lives a little more normally, it's always there. And as Terence said, sadly, COVID-19 isn't going anywhere. Case levels in our county continue to be incredibly high at the moment. However, we are starting to see a decrease in those rates compared to previous weeks. So I'm going to just talk you through some of the figures for us locally in Wiltshire. So this data comes from 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, which showed us that we'd had 4,178 new cases in the last 7 days in Wiltshire. Now that compares to 6,799 at the same point in the previous week, so you can see that decrease. Our current 7-day case rate is 828.9, and again that compares to 1,348.8 at the same time last week. And actually the data for today has just come out and we're in the high 700s, so again another decrease today. Now the national case rate of cases is at 1,128.9, so we are currently below the national rate of cases, which is somewhere that we hadn't been for a little while. Now in Wiltshire there have also been 953 registered deaths in total that included COVID-19 on the death certificate. That's data up until the end of December, and we mustn't ever get numb to these kinds of numbers, any of these sorts of numbers. It's very easy to talk about case rates and figures, but each and every one of those is a person, and our thoughts and condolences go out to anyone who has suffered a loss because of this pandemic. Now, although we are seeing that decrease of cases at the moment in the last 8 days. We've seen that very high rate come down. The rate of infection overall is still incredibly high at the moment in our county and across the rest of the country. Now we are seeing particularly high case numbers in those individuals aged 20 to 44, but numbers are really fairly high throughout all of our age ranges. And what we anticipate in the next couple of weeks as our schools have gone back is we'll start to see those rates climbing again in the sort of 5 to 9 year age range. Now, with some changes to testing policy, we know that case rate data in and of itself will become a slightly less comprehensive indicator as to what's actually happening in the population. And so that's why it's really important for you to know that we base any decisions locally on a whole range of indicators. Those indicators will include the ONS prevalence data, mortality data, hospital admissions, and all of the outbreak information that we deal with and we gather across a whole range of settings, from schools to care homes to businesses. I imagine you'll have seen the recent impact that the high rate of infection has had on our local hospitals. So both Great Western Hospital in Swindon and the Royal United Hospital in Bath declared internal critical incidents earlier in the month due to the high number of patients in bed with COVID, but also due to the very high rates of staff absences due to illness. Now things have eased on that front, thankfully, but the system as a whole for health and care is still under a lot of pressure. We continue to work very closely with healthcare and local authority colleagues across the Bath and North East Somerset, Swindon and Wiltshire area to ensure we are all aware of any issues and we can work together to support each other as and when required. Now, the government has confirmed that Plan B measures will remain in place for the time being. They will be reviewing these on the 26th of January. Although case numbers remain high in the county, just as they are throughout the country, it is really clear from what we're seeing from the data that people are continuing to be cautious, which is really great, and particularly in the usage of lateral flow tests. And that will have certainly helped to prevent even more cases from emerging. So just as a reminder, if you are planning to meet up with groups of people outside your household, or perhaps meeting a vulnerable family member, then it makes really good sense to take a lateral flow test prior to going. But just remember that in itself, a negative lateral flow result does not guarantee you aren't infectious. So in addition, don't forget the other really simple measures as well. So those include washing your hands regularly with warm and soapy water, wearing a mask where required, opening some windows to let that fresh air circulate if you're meeting people indoors. And all of those measures, when we layer them up together, offer us much more protection against transmitting the virus. I'm just going to pop back to lateral flow tests for a moment, and just to remind people that if you receive a positive lateral flow test result, you will be required to self-isolate immediately now, but you don't need to take a confirmatory PCR test. So anyone who receives a positive lateral flow test should also make sure they report the result on the gov.uk website. Now this pausing of the confirmatory PCR is a temporary measure while the COVID rates remain very high across the UK. And again, hopefully does that little bit extra to keep the country moving, which should help those businesses and organisations, particularly those adversely affected by staffing absences. But it is important to note, and this is really important, that if you are eligible and you want to access the test and trace support payment that's available for isolation, then there is still a requirement for a confirmatory PCR result. So you must get that PCR result if you want to access the test and trace support payment. And as I say, whilst levels of COVID continue to be high, the vast majority of people with a positive lateral flow result can be very confident that they have COVID-19. Now, it's important that when you do take a lateral flow test now, regardless of whether it's positive, negative or even void, you register the result on the government website. That information really helps us to build a clear picture of how the virus is developing in Wiltshire. And I think the message can sometimes get lost, but important to emphasise, lateral flow tests are for people who have no symptoms. If you do have the common symptoms of COVID-19, then please self-isolate and book a PCR test. Now, you'll be aware that due to the national very high demand, there have been supply issues with lateral flow tests, but things do seem to be getting better on that front, and you should continue to regularly visit the government website to order more lateral flow tests should you need them. And those other locations you were used to, such as pharmacies and our own community collect sites, are now regularly receiving stock. I would advise that you really should only order what you need, though. There is a natural instinct amongst all of us to stock up on things when we think they're running low, but that creates an even bigger problem for everybody. And just to let you know, we do have stock at our collection sites that we run. There's a big long list of them, so I'll try and get them all. There's Devizes Leisure Centre, Bourne-Hill in Salisbury, Monkton Park in Chippenham, Springfield Community Campus in Corsham, Calne Leisure Centre, the Vale Community Campus in Pewsham and the Nada Centre in Tisbury. Although our recent stock issues have eased, we are currently having to limit the packs we hand out to 2 per household, but we will keep that under review as our supplies return to normal. Now, the management of those lateral flow tests is a government-run programme, and they have said that during periods of exceptional demand, they may be temporarily pausing those orders and receiving tests online, and that's really so they can ensure they manage the distribution across the system. Government has also rolled out their programme in getting lateral flow tests out to those they have identified as critical workers. That's about 100,000 people across the country, and that again should really help to limit disruption to key services. And then one other key change to the guidance is that as of yesterday, Monday the 17th, people with COVID in England can end their self-isolation after 5 full days, as long as they've tested negative on day 5 and on day 6. Now, that decision was made after careful consideration of modelling from the UK Health Security Agency, and is really to support essential public services and workforces over the rest of the winter period. Now, it is crucial that people isolating with COVID-19 wait until they've received 2 negative lateral flow tests on 2 consecutive days to reduce the chance of them still being infectious. The first test must be taken no earlier than day 5 of the self-isolation period, and the second test must be taken the following day, 24 hours later. If an individual is positive on day 5, then the negative test is required on day 6 and then on day 7 to release from isolation. As I said, it's essential 2 negative rapid lateral flow tests are taken on consecutive days and reported before individuals return to their job or education if they are going to leave self-isolation earlier than the full 10-day period. And just to note, there is specific guidance about this change that relates to health and care workers, which I'm sure we can share the link to in the chat function for everybody. And then finally, from me, if you haven't already done so, please get your booster or come for your first and second vaccination. They have proven to be incredibly safe and incredibly effective. The facts really are that if you are fully vaccinated, then you are at much less risk of becoming seriously ill or having to be hospitalised due to COVID-19. And if you have any questions or queries, then please speak to a health professional, get your questions answered, and then please come for that vaccination. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass you on to our Wiltshire Council leader, Councillor Richard Kluwer.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to make a couple of comments around COVID before moving on to the budget. I think the first thing, and I think it's something that needs to be said, is that we've probably all been watching events in Westminster and particularly Downing Street with a degree of anger and well, extreme anger. Standards there have clearly fallen way below those we would have expected in terms of following rules. That doesn't reflect what I have seen and heard from Wiltshire and the way we have behaved in Wiltshire throughout the pandemic. And I just want to reiterate and thank everyone for all of the efforts and sacrifices that you have made, that we have all made during what have been an extremely difficult and disruptive and at times frustrating a period of time over the course of the pandemic. I don't think we should take any of the sacrifices people have made during this period lightly, and I think it really is worth noting and reflecting on. I want to pay tribute to the way our communities came together. We always say we've got strong communities in Wiltshire, and we don't really know what that means. And if I just reflect there slightly on my own experience, the villages I represent, I came down with COVID pretty much as soon as lockdown started, so spent the first couple of weeks in bed really rather unwell. But by the time I'd recovered enough to start sending out emails, all of my villages already had support networks up and running and were bombarding with requests to what to do, how to help, and use the volunteers. It really was an outstanding response. I can't say I was surprised by it because our communities always rally together, but it was the first time I saw it properly happen, and it really was good to see. Also, from a council point of view, the way our staff have performed and gone from moving full speed ahead in one direction to suddenly having the gears stripped out of the system and moving full speed in a different direction addressing COVID. Again, I think the response there has been really good, and I do think we owe them thanks. Very often the NHS is singled out, rightly so. They were at the forefront of this, but equally our bin men, our care workers, our council staff were also at the forefront, and I think that's worth acknowledging. If I move on then to the budget, it's that budget time of year, And I thought it would be helpful to try and give you an overview of the proposals that we are putting forward for the next financial year, also really for the next 3 financial years, to try and give an understanding of the picture, the position we find ourselves in, that we face, and why we are proposing some of the decisions that we are. The council always makes savings, always has, certainly since I've been elected. Most of those you wouldn't notice as members of the public. Most of those go through a savings in the way that our services are run, improvements in efficiency, changes to the way we do things. And that's a continual process. However, when COVID hit, we had a series of savings we were in the process of delivering, and we simply didn't have the resource to deliver them. And then when we looked at last year's budget, we had because of the support government was giving us, the financial support in particular, we had a hold steady budget. In essence, we replicated the previous year's budget, increased from inflation, and then left it all alone. And that means that for 2 years, we haven't been going through that savings process. And that makes this coming year particularly challenging. Now, government have given us support, and they do understand there is a need to smooth through that process. So there is government support there. We've stuck it in what we've called our budget equalisation reserve. I wouldn't get too hung up on the terms, and that is there to enable us to smooth over the process of the next couple of years, as we then bring bring savings back online, bring budgets back online. So it's a complicated budget. It's more complicated than any I've been involved in the council, in my time in the council so far, which I was first elected when Wiltshire Council was created. It also links in strongly with our business plan. I'll come on to the business plan priorities and the business plan later, but hopefully that will explain, as you look at the budget and then look at the business plan, to understand the direction of travel that we are taking as a council. I am really keen as leader that we focus on the strategic long term as an authority, that we don't concentrate on resolving today's problems, but we concentrate on resolving the problems we face over the long term. And that means having budgets that aren't just year on year, but that are looking several years ahead, and also a business plan that looks several years ahead. Now, with this budget, there are uncertainties still in the system. We have this budget equalisation reserve, which should help us get through the next 2 years. We're also dependent on finding the details of government's reforms to adult social care, and those are significant. They will have great impacts on that market, and it's very hard right now to predict what those impacts will be. So we have decided to put forward a budget that is erring on the side of caution at the moment, that is making sure that this year we have a completely balanced budget. We're not using any of that reserve. We're saving the reserve to deal with the uncertainty that comes in, particularly as we enter this period of rapid change over adult social care funding. And that also means that we are looking at potentially making, and I'll come on to them again later, some of the more difficult decisions now, because by doing that now, it gives us that stable financial footing to be able to continue delivering all the services that we deliver. We've got an overall budget proposed for next year of 417 million. Of that, half of it, 235 million, will be spent on services supporting people, including all the care and support that we provide for adults and children. More than half our money goes on looking after the most vulnerable in society, and that is, again, really important to note, because if we're not looking after them, there really is no one to look after them, and we've got to work very tightly and closely with the NHS on that. But it's not the only place we spend money. We've got 92 million being spent on place services, such as roads, waste services, carbon reduction, leisure, libraries, all the other services we provide. I'm going to hand over now to Andy to explain some of the detail of the budget, and I'll then come back in afterwards to talk through some of the proposals around savings. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Good evening, everyone. So I just wanted to run through a bit of context behind the budget figures, and hopefully that will provide a bit of example of where our funding comes from, and indeed where we spend that funding that is generated as well. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So this gives a demonstration of where our funding comes from. So you can see that the majority of our funding comes from council tax, The social care levy is also generated through council tax as well. So when you include that along with business rates, the council actually generates nearly 90% of its funding from local taxes. And therefore the amount that we get through from government grant, and you can see that through specific grants, is actually quite a small proportion of our funding overall. It only amounts to around 12%. So we are significantly dependent on the amount of tax that we raise locally to deliver services. Just go to the next slide, please. We just thought we'd put into some context, therefore, where that funding goes. And you heard Richard talk about the majority of our funding going on providing services to vulnerable people. And indeed, you can see there when you look at £35 per 100 going on caring for adults, and then £20 going on children and young people, that you can see that over 55% of our funding goes on the provision for those services. You can see from that slide as well, just to give you a bit of context around where the rest of our funding goes, and in terms of giving an overview of where we spend our services to provide services, residents, communities and businesses of Wiltshire as well. So I just wanted to concentrate on a bit of the challenges that have faced us in setting the budget this year. So first and foremost, the pandemic. We're now approaching, unbelievably, our third financial year since the pandemic started back in 2020. And of course, no one could have predicted the impact it would have had, and that impact for us is ongoing. We've got a strong track record of being financially sound and stable, and that has certainly helped us having a strong footing during this time. And we know that's not necessarily been the case with other local authorities and other councils across the country. But that level of uncertainty that comes with the pandemic continues to be a risk. And in terms of demand on services, we're having to make assumptions at this point in time when we come to set the budget. But within that, we are holding reserves in place to be able to deal with any demand that goes beyond those assumptions, and particularly referencing children's social care in terms of demand that may come through in the system for services in the future. Back in December, the Secretary of State announced the what's called the Provisional Local Government Settlement. So that details how much grant funding comes to councils, together with other measures that were aimed at supporting council finances. We, within Wiltshire, were confirmed that we'll be getting around an additional £12.5 million in funding for this financial year. There's a little less than we would have obviously liked, but alongside our sound financial planning, it will certainly help us be on a strong footing going forward. Just also want to talk about inflation. It's a significant factor in this year's budget, and more so in previous financial years. We're talking about inflation generally in terms of contractual inflation and indeed national pay awards, and we're also looking at increasing demand for service provision and changes in legislation. But when you look at inflation, rising inflation, we're looking at potential at areas of hyperinflation, so up to 60% inflation on some of our energy bills, and we're looking to manage that pressure, as indeed every household is looking at potential increases in energy and other inflation going forward as well. That's coupled with managing demand for our key services, particularly again ageing demographic and needs coming through in social care. Overall, when you look at inflation alone, we're expecting that to cost us around more than £46 million over the next 3 financial years. And in 22-23, given the current position on consumer price index CPI inflation, that's going to be around £21 million alone. As I've always said, increased demand for services is also a significant challenge that we're facing. And some demand is easier to anticipate and plan for others, and is often dependent on that specific service. So, for example, waste management is driven through the number of households that we have and the number of total tonnage of waste that is produced and needs to be collected and then managed and disposed of. For adult social care, that will be dependent on the number of residents that are requiring packages of care or placements in a care setting. The latter, as I've said before, is dependent on that ageing demographic, and it will have a significant impact on the amount of demand that is predicated to arise. Lastly, in terms of income, in addition to council tax and business rates, we also raise income through fees and charges, through fees and charges to deliver services such as car parking and leisure. We've also updated those assumptions and we reflected that in terms of an improving position from those income streams that were significantly impacted as a result of the pandemic. That continues to improve, and although in 22-23 there is an increase in the assumption around income, we are yet to see those levels back to pre-pandemic levels, and we continue to improve upon that across the remainder of the MTFS, the medium-term financial strategy, I should say. That's all the context I wanted to give, and I'll hand you back to Richard. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Andy. So with these challenges in mind, we've got what, £27 million worth of what we call savings to identify in the next financial year. Now, a couple of comments around that. We are not spending less money than we did this year. We are spending more. We are investing more. But in reality, we're moving around about 45, well, somewhere between 45 and 50 million pounds, depending on how you cut the piece of cake up, of our spending around. Some of that we get funding from government from, and some of it we have other income streams coming in. It is easier to handle, but we've still got to essentially move around about 7% of the money we spend to address the demand we face. So when we're talking about savings, these aren't simply cuts. In fact, for the most part, they're not cuts. What they are is reassigning, moving money to focus on areas where we have a statutory requirement to spend it, and also to try and make sure things are running as efficiently as possible. I also think it's worth setting quickly a bit of national context. The challenges we're facing are being faced by every other council across the country that I'm aware of, possibly with the exception of Westminster with its business rates. But these challenges are huge, and they are nationwide. There are councils that spend 85% of their budget on the two items that Andy mentioned, caring for adults and looking after children and young people. We're not in that position. There are councils under a great deal more strain than we are, but we have all, as councils, got to make sure that we are being extremely sensible in the way that we are assigning our budgets, and not creating, not desperately trying to use a short-term fix that in return is going to create much more significant problems in the long term. Pandemic hasn't helped us in terms of budgeting, but it's also given us a chance to reassess some of what we're doing. I'll come on a little more detail there in a second. And dealing with the challenges as we emerge from it, it is going to be extremely challenging. In terms of what we're proposing, where it will impact on you, we're proposing a 1.99% increase in council tax, and a 1% levy for adult social care. Now, I know government has said that they've put in proposals with the funding around the national insurance increase to resolve social care. That programme doesn't properly kick in terms of the social care element for 3 years. The first 3 years are about addressing NHS backlog, and the strains on social care and the strains on the cost strains on social care haven't gone away. In fact, if anything, they are more acute this year than they probably have been, well, certainly have been in the existence of Wiltshire Council. So I'm afraid we do need to take advantage of that extra 1% levy this year. It'll raise about 3 million, just over, and that helps fund some of the 7 million growth that we're looking at addressing inside the adult social care budget. What does that mean in reality? If you're in a Band D property, it's an increase of what, 91 pence per week, £47.56 a year. So yes, we are proposing putting up council tax, but we think it is the sensible way to address the pressures that we are facing. 90% of our budget, as Andy said, our funding comes from local taxes and business rates, and it is the main tool that we have got for increasing our revenue, increasing our funding. We're also proposing to do a number of other things that I suspect some of you will get frustrated with, will not like. We are looking at increasing parking charges by 10 pence an hour on all the tariffs in our car parks. Introducing charging for blue badges, that's something we've resisted for a very long time. All our neighbouring authorities charge for blue badge parking. And I have to be honest, it's one of the things in the budget I would much rather we weren't having to do, but we have got to come up with a balanced, sensible budget that addresses our need to raise revenue and control costs. And I'm afraid it's something that we are having to put forward. And we're also going to be looking at introducing parking charges on a Sunday. We haven't increased parking charges for 4 years. And to be clear, I would have no intention of increasing parking charges again in the next 4 years. You have to put through something called a traffic regulation order when you do. That's an expensive process to go through. We want to look at doing this once and then leaving them alone for the next 4 years. And if you look at the funding, the parking charging area alone is raising more than £800,000. If we didn't do that and instead used our reserves to fund it, then in 3 years' time, we'd be sitting on £2.5 million deficit that we wouldn't have a clue how to fund, and that would just be fixed, taking a short-term fix to create a much larger long-term problem. The other thing I would emphasise on parking charges is that we use profit from parking, and there is profit from it, to fund rural buses. And we are primarily a rural county. Based on government's definition, 75% of us live in what they define as a village or small town, population of under 10,000. And in those environments, if you don't have a car, you are absolutely reliant on public transport, and rural public transport is hard enough to make work at the best of times. The pandemic has absolutely shredded bus use. The strain placed on bus companies is huge. They are slowly rebuilding. We've had support from government with the bus improvement schemes, but we're increasingly having to look at funding and supporting more bus services. If you just take a look at the headlines recently, there was an issue about a bus running through Warminster, where we are having to go out to try and find a new provider because it was decided by the existing bus company that it was unsustainable. We're also proposing to increase the amount we charge for green waste bins from £50 to £60 a year. Again, that was last increased, I think, 3 years ago. I wouldn't propose that we will be increasing it again for the next 4 years. I would very much hope that will not be the case. And again, this raises almost £500,000. So if we don't take these steps, then what we're left with is significant holes in the budget moving forward, that we will only be able to address by making other decisions that I would class as being more unpalatable. We are not closing any libraries or leisure centres in this process, and I'm really keen that we do not do that. But if we don't make some of these decisions, those are the decisions we end up looking at making. We're going to fall in line again with our neighbouring authorities and charge for the disposal of non-household waste at our household recycling centres. Basically, that means rubble, soil, plasterboard, tyres and asbestos. Again, it's something I would rather we weren't having to do, but it will raise revenue that we need, and it has. If you look at all the surrounding counties that have introduced it, it has worked. It hasn't had significant impacts on the fly tipping, which I know is one of the concerns that people raise at that idea. We're also proposing a reduction in Wiltshire Council staffing budgets. Those will amount to 10 million over the next 2 years. About 70% of that will be taken next year. Now, the pandemic has forced us to change our ways of working really quite dramatically. It has meant actually that we have become a lot more efficient in the way that we work. Productivity has been better, and there have been changes that we've been able to bring in place that honestly we were wanting to make and were finding it very difficult to move forward with, that the enforced working from home of the pandemic has have become normal. So there are savings to be taken from that new working structure, and the way that we are redefining some of and reshaping some of the teams inside the council. We're aiming to do this through the deletion of vacant posts, which aren't business critical, and delaying recruitment in some areas, and then looking at, as I said, those organisational structures. There are some discussions with trade unions around changes on terms and conditions that will deliver further savings, and also, more importantly, that will limit the number of roles that we will look to delete, because you can only take that kind of efficiency so far. We think there are savings to make, but we don't want to go so far that we actually damage the services we provide. Now, despite talking about savings and cuts, and I appreciate that will probably dominate the media debates that we have on this in our local media, it's also really important to note that we are continuing with the £1 million a year that we are using to support our high streets and market towns and Salisbury. That the money that we're spending there, we are looking at developing things like the Heritage Trail app, the What's On in Wiltshire app. These are our programs that are designed to draw people into our market towns. At the moment, you can get your shopping delivered at home, you can go to out-of-town retail centres. The reason to go into a town centre has become increasingly less, and we need to rebuild market towns and the city based on leisure, on culture, heritage, on local tourism. And so we're looking at supporting that work to give people reasons to go into towns that they may not have been into for a long time because they've been instead shopping online. We're also investing 1.7 million to increase capacity in our special educational needs and inclusion services. And then if we come on to the capital programme, coming financial year, our capital programme still stands at 307 million. Some of that is money that we are borrowing and spending ourselves. Some comes from central government and government schemes, and some of the stuff that we're delivering is entirely self-funding. But if you want the key headlines there, we'll be investing over 3 million in leisure, including 800,000 in new fitness equipment, 800,000 into local highways and footpath improvements. There'll be 2 million next year as part of a £25 million commitment to a new Trowbridge Leisure Centre. This has been something that's been discussed for too long. It needs delivering now, and we will be getting underway properly on that this year. We've got the future high street projects for Salisbury and Trowbridge. There'll be 10 million going in there, 16 million on highway structural maintenance, 27 million on the Council House build programme, and an additional 17 million refurbishing Council House stock, all of which is self-funded in the housing revenue account, so isn't requiring additional funding from the council as a larger body. We've got 46 million invested in education and skills, including 6.5 million investment in school maintenance. There are some of our school buildings that really do need updating at this point. We're spending 8 million on making our own council properties more energy efficient, so you can see that green agenda is running through the investments that we're making. And then we've got the inclusion of improvements to the A350 junction M4 junction 17, 27.8 million. We should get the Melksham campus opening this year as well, which again is good news. I'm very much looking forward to getting a chance to go and seeing what the new Melksham campus looks like. So my notes say that I should say that that's a succinct way of summing up the budget. I'm not sure it's succinct. I don't think you can be succinct with a budget. It's complicated, but that's the crux of our budget. It's been a really tough couple of years. It's been a really tough budget to put together, but I think it puts us on a very good, stable footing moving forward. And it gives us a great way to then focus on delivering on the business plan and the requirements that we have there. If we move perhaps onto the next slide, talking about the business plan, we've got the draft business plan out now. It comprises of three elements. You've got the principles, the core underlying principles. You've then got a series of service delivery plans that are held by each of our the departments inside the council, and it's critical, and I've been absolutely clear on this. I don't want to see children's services working in isolation and adults and then highways. I want all of the departments of the council and all of our partners to be coming together to address the problems that we identify, rather than working in isolation and in silos. And then behind that, there will be a series of metrics. There is no point in having a business plan and clear, detailed plans that underpin it without being able to measure whether it's succeeding or not. And those metrics in the format that we're bringing them forward are new for Wiltshire Council. We gather an awful lot of information. We've not been good enough at looking at it, measuring and seeing whether we are achieving on the elements of our plans or not. And this business plan will make sure that we are able to do so. So please do at least read through the principles, so you get an idea of the direction of travel that we are setting for the council and in each area. That's definitely enough waffle from me. So at that point, I will hand back to Kerry, and I gather we're going to be going through the questions that have been asked.
Thanks, Richard. That's great, and I'm sure everyone will agree that's a very comprehensive overview of a complicated budget. So Well, yes, as you say, do the questions and answers now. So firstly, a couple of questions have come in for Kate. So Kate, will schools still be supplying LFDs to parents for their children to use, as some have said that they aren't able to?
Okay, thanks, Carrie. So schools can still access tests through the Department for Education portal, but if they are struggling with supplies, as I said earlier, people can now access test kits from the online government portal, from pharmacy and from our community test sites. And with supply levels really getting better and better as we go on, that should be no problem now for people to access.
Thank you. And what is the latest on the vaccination programme, particularly now that boosters have been announced for 16 to 17-year-olds, and what may this mean for schools?
Okay, so our current understanding is that those boosters for 16 and 17-year-olds will be accessed through the vaccination sites. They'll need to be booked through the national booking site rather than them being administered in schools.
Thank you, Kate. So I'm just going to cover a few that have come in the chat this evening, which are for Councillor Clewett. So Councillor Clewett, why should I pay an extra 1% for social care in my council tax when I don't use that service?
When we gather tax, it's not just for the services we're going to use. We gather it also to deal with services to the most vulnerable people in society, those we need to look after. And we all need to pay to do that. One day we will all be old, and who knows what care we will need then. So I think it's entirely reasonable that we all put our money in to fund all of the services we use, whether it be roads or services for young people, vulnerable young people, or adults in the case of the adult social care precept, to look after older people who are not able to look after and support themselves and fund themselves.
Thank you. And very directly for you, Richard, Councillor Clewett, do you think the Prime Minister should resign?
I was expecting it. I think I'll give the same answer I've given to the national media I've spoken to. When I was a junior army officer based in Tidworth, the main lesson I took away was that to lead, you've got to have integrity, you've got to have honesty, and you've got to lead by example. Now, I don't think anyone would deny that the behaviour in Downing Street from the Prime Minister, from the senior civil servants, from Sir Keir Starmer as well, and any MP who attended work parties fell way below that which we'd expect. I would think all of them need to go away and do some serious soul searching and think about how they respond to regain public trust. Being more specific, I think if the Gray report, when that comes out, it is critical of the Prime Minister. Honestly, I think at that point his position is untenable. I guess I should answer bluntly. I think if I had done what he had done, I'd probably resign, yes.
Thank you very much. Are you planning to improve public transport now you're increasing parking charges? Buses in my village are terrible, so if I want to go to Chippenham or elsewhere, I have to drive. So surely if you're adding charges, you should at least improve other offers to give choice.
Short term, I think we're going to have to try and maintain public transport. I would love to be improving it. In the manifesto that my party stood on, that we won the election on, and more importantly now in the business plan, we do reference particularly the need to come up with a better model for rural transport. I'm sure we all see large buses driving through our villages with 2 or 3 people on them, and you just think, what on earth is going on? So I think there is something there, and I think government are taking the right steps in looking at responsive bus services, particularly around minibuses or smaller vehicles than the giant buses we see. It's going to take a number of steps to get there. It will take some changes to national legislation, but that direction of travel is already coming out of Westminster, which is good. So we need to be ready. We need to develop responsive bus models inside the law, which still means using the bus companies and large buses. We need to engage with bus companies about trying to use smaller ones, and we need to be ready to respond to that, because I think we could significantly improve rural bus transport by having a different model. We've just got to get to the point where we can get that model running. But first, for the next year, we've got to deal with the fact that far too few people are using buses, which is making bus services incredibly difficult to maintain. And we've got to get the bus services we've got back on a stable footing as well.
Thank you. And just the last one for you at the moment, Richard. What plans do you have to attract young couples and families to Wiltshire rather than retired? You mentioned an ageing demographic and rising demand. So how will you encourage new people to the area?
Goodness, that one's tricky. I think one of the big problems for particularly young families is house prices. I think we need to make sure we continue to deliver as much affordable housing as possible. That's more about enabling families to stay in Wiltshire, or younger people to stay in Wiltshire, than attracting them in. I think when you look at the demographic where people perhaps have got a couple of kids, we then get people moving back into Wiltshire. Often they will go away and start their careers somewhere else. So I don't think we necessarily have a problem attracting them in, although I do think house prices can be a barrier to many people. We are an extremely nice county. I mean, well, we all chose to live here for a reason. I certainly did. I go back to my army days when I chose to live here. I absolutely fell in love with the area around Salisbury when I was based in Tidworth. So I don't think we've got a problem to attract people in. I think we've just got to make sure that we've got the right mix of housing to enable families to come here, because it is, having brought my own kids up here, my daughter is in her last year at school, it is an absolutely ideal place to raise a family.
Thank you. Terence, one for you here. What grants are currently available for businesses affected by COVID and the Omicron variant?
Thanks, Kerry. Today we've opened our applications for the Omicron Hospitality and Leisure Grant. Now that offers, it's a one-off grant, and it's up to £6,000 available to rateable businesses. Now the grant's aimed at those in hospitality, leisure and accommodation, and the value of each grant depends on the business's rateable value. So for someone to apply, visit the website, read the terms and conditions, complete the online form. Now, all businesses need to reapply for the Omicron Hospitality and Leisure Grant, even if they've previously had a COVID business grant. And we're also finalising additional restrictions grant, and I'm going to encourage all businesses to sign up to our business newsletter for up-to-date information on the grants. And I think we're putting some details in the chat. Is that right, Kerry?
Yes, that's correct. We'll be posting the details in the chat. Yes. Richard, would you be able to outline how we're proposing to deal with climate change?
Yes. Firstly, from a council point of view, we are committed to reduce our emissions as a corporate entity to zero by 2030. We've already reduced them by 80% since 2016. We are well on track to delivering that. We've got a climate strategy and the rather unedifyingly titled Green Blue Infrastructure Plan coming to Cabinet and then full council in February for adoption, and that will help us lay out the sort of next steps that we can take in terms of trying to move the county forward in that regard. It's really worth noting, however, that a lot of the progress that we can make here is dependent on factors outside of our control. We need central government to change legislation on planning. There is an institutional insanity that has pervaded house building in the UK over decades now for not moving to a zero carbon standard, or perhaps 10 years ago a much lower carbon standard for housing. That means we've now got expensive retrofit that will happen to all the new houses that are being built right now. That is nuts. We are working really hard to lobby and work with government. I meet with ministers, discuss this with them, to emphasise what needs to happen to give us the ability to make more headway, particularly on the housing side. Transport, we need to make sure that we've got a rural bus service, that we've got bus services still functioning, that we've got dedicated cycle paths across the county, not taking away on-street parking to put cycle lanes in, but making proper cycle lanes that people can use safely. But we've also got to accept that cars are a significant part of our economy, and that they're not going to go away, and that they will decarbonise themselves as we move to electric or potentially hydrogen vehicles, depending on whichever technology wins there. So we're doing what we can with the areas that are directly under our control. We've got plans to lay out how we can proceed with the rest of it, and we're working very closely with government to try and move them forward and coming up with the appropriate tools to help there. And just to emphasise how important it is, I, as well as leading Wiltshire Council, I also chair the Countryside Climate Network, which is a subgroup of UK 100, making sure that there is a strong rural voice going into government so they understand the challenges we face in terms of how we tackle this issue moving forward, because our issues are not the same as metropolitan areas, and too much policy is based on metropolitan areas.
Thank you, Richard. So we've got time for 2 more questions. The first one is about parking charges and the final one is about the business plan. So first of all, why are you proposing to increase things like parking charges when the cost of living is already increasing so much? And added on to that, why are you aligning your blue badge charging just because everyone else does?
As I said when I was talking about this earlier, it's not something we're doing because we want to. It's something we're doing because the financial pressures we make, the inflation that we as a council face, mean that our costs are going up and we have to find ways to pay for them. And particularly when we're looking at parking, we have to find ways to support that rural bus transport. So that's why we are looking at putting those charges up. If we didn't, then we would be facing a £2.5 million hole in our finances in 2 years' time, and we'd be having to cut something really significant to fill that. And I don't think that would be a responsible way to approach that issue. I also think it's worth noting that the cost of actually running car parks goes up year on year. The cost of collecting cash is ridiculously high. As part of this budget, we're also looking at putting in contactless payment machines in all our car parks and transitioning away from cash. I don't know how many of you carry cash anymore. I found since the pandemic, I don't have any. So we need to make sure that we adapt there as well. On the blue badges, again, if you look at the logic of people who have a blue badge, they're issued because of the mobility issues, but that doesn't mean they're not issued on the basis of whether people are able to pay for their parking or not. I have had a number of residents, certainly in my own division, have come to me and said, why on earth do we get free parking with a blue badge? They're elderly residents, they've got mobility issues, but they still want to be paying for their parking. Is it ideal? No, it's the one that gives me the most challenge in this entire budget process. But it is part of the package that we need to put through in order to have a balanced budget and make sure that we are not putting the council at financial risk in the future.
Thank you, Richard. And then finally, on the business plan, I note the aim to stay active is in the business plan, and I'd like to know what thoughts or ambitions you have around the broader health support infrastructure.
Yeah, really good question. There are a lot of strands to this. We are proposing to keep all of our leisure centres going. We have a lot across the county. We want to make sure they are still functioning. They're places where people can get to remain active and stay fit and healthy. We also want to make sure that people have access to the wider countryside. Through lockdown, a lot of us have been out walking more in the countryside than we have previously. Some of our footpaths are perhaps not in the best of repair. Finger posts are missing. We want to improve that access. We want to improve access through cycle paths. There's a lot of government funding we can look at to bid for cycle paths, and I've been really clear with officers. I want us to be looking at schemes that connect villages to towns and towns to other towns, and that connect them all together and make sure that we have got a proper interconnected cycle network. I also am really keen that we make sure public health is working more closely with our health and wellbeing, our leisure centres, to help promote activity. So yeah, it's really important for us. You'll find it's a theme that runs throughout the business plan.
Great, thank you very much. So that's all of the questions. I'm just going to hand back to Terence now for some closing remarks. Thank you everyone for your questions this evening.
Thanks, Kerry. So that brings tonight's session to an end. I hope you managed to get something out of it. We will host another session should the need arise, because obviously it's very important that you have all the information that you need, particularly when guidance is still changing fairly regularly. If you missed any part of tonight's event, or you know somebody might find it useful, we're going to post a recording of it on our social media channels tomorrow, so please keep an eye out for it. And if you can share the recording on your own social media feeds too, that would be great, so we can reach as wide an audience as possible. And if you want to keep up to date on Wiltshire Council news, there is a weekly, please visit our website and receive our newsletter, as there's lots of useful information in there. Finally, I'd like to echo Kate's message: please get vaccinated and boosted if you haven't done so yet. I think given all the sacrifices that you've all made during this pretty difficult time, it's the least that we could and should do. And so I'd like to thank you for joining us, and on behalf of Richard, Kate, Andy, Kerry and myself, please take care and enjoy the rest of your evening.